I'm Karen Young, and I'm a senior fellow and director of the program on economics and energy at the Middle East Institute. And it's my pleasure to have this conversation, this fireside chat, even though we don't have a fire, with Badr Jafar, who is CEO of Crescent Enterprises and founder of the Pearl Initiative. So welcome, Badr. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us.
Great pleasure to join you. Thank you.
So we've been having this conference this week in partnership with Foreign Policy and the Middle East Institute, really looking forward and thinking about what the Middle East region will be like 5-10 years from now. And a lot of the conversations have focused back on the role of the state, as an investor for economic growth, as a jobs creator, but also as an engine of innovation. But your work tackles a different kind of engine of growth and innovation, and that sort of, the importance of civil society and the importance of philanthropy, both as, perhaps a source of job creation, but also a source of idea generation. The idea that the relationship between civil society and governments in the Middle East is a conflicted one and has been for years. And we still see a lot of sort of struggle for, what is the role of philanthropy, of nonprofits, of the third sector in general, across the region. So I want to ask you, how would you describe the state of the philanthropic sector in the MENA region, the role of it, and what's required to enhance the role that the philanthropy can play in addressing some of the challenges, particularly, the jobs challenge, the demographic challenges that we're seeing in the region? What has your work shown you? And you've been doing this for quite a while now.
So I've been saying this for some time now, but for far too long, philanthropy has been treated like the neglected child of our capital system, seen by many really as a peripheral player, and in some parts of the world, parts of the Middle East included, often regarded with a high degree of suspicion. The reality is that well over $1 trillion of private philanthropic capital, more than triple the annual global development and humanitarian aid budgets combined, is deployed every single year. In the US alone, as you know, over $470 billion was made available in private philanthropy last year. And here in the MENA region, and in the broader Islamic world, we have a long history of charitable giving. Today, anywhere between $400 billion to $1 trillion is disbursed in Islamic philanthropy every year between zakat and sadaqah. These are huge sums that dwarf the foreign aid budgets of even the most generous countries. To put the lower end of that estimate in context, that's triple the global annual humanitarian and development aid budgets. But do we know where exactly this money is going, what impact it's generating? The reality is we don't always know. And with 2/3 of the population in the Middle East classified as either living below the poverty line or vulnerable to poverty, what is therefore certain is that we're not optimizing the use of this capital, including strategically partnering it up with government and business capital to address our most urgent challenges. And this is really why I was fortunate enough to partner with the likes of the University of Cambridge on the establishment of a center for strategic philanthropy, exclusively focused on strategic philanthropy within and from the world's emerging markets, including Africa, developing Asia, and of course the Middle East. And more recently with NYU Abu Dhabi on a similar initiative dedicated to the Gulf region. And the work of these centers focuses on three interrelated tracks. First is really understanding the past, present, and also aspirational future of philanthropy in these markets through research. Second, providing education and training to the next generation of philanthropic leaders to emerge from these regions of the world. And finally, convening diverse voices to improve the understanding of philanthropy in these markets with a view to developing policy recommendations to enhance its impact and effectiveness. In many respects, Karen, this is all about building the infrastructure for philanthropy to strive really across these markets. And I think the timing is great, right? The top 30 fastest growing economies in the world are all in emerging markets. And it's estimated that more than $5 trillion of wealth will be passed from one generation to the next within these economies over the next decade or so. And so this suggests that there'll be a significant increase in philanthropic activity in these societies in the coming years, including here in the Middle East. So as I said, the time is now.
I think it's really interesting, these projects that you've developed, and congratulations on them at Cambridge and also at NYU Abu Dhabi, and really defining this sort of science of strategic philanthropy. And maybe you can talk a little bit more about what that is. And I think it kind of really is sort of the sister or the brother to impact investing in a lot of ways. It's looking at, can you measure the outcomes? Can you see where the money goes, and what is the outcome that you want to see grow? So I think that's really interesting. And then you also bring up this incredible point on the demographics, particularly in the Gulf, of this transfer of wealth between generations. So, what is this generation want? I mean, what are their policy goals? Is it about climate? Is it about youth inclusion? I mean, how do you build these programs and teach people how to be strategic investors, strategic philanthropists in the causes they care about? And maybe you could say a little bit about some of those causes that you're seeing emerge as the priorities.
So on strategic philanthropy, I mean, as you say, it's essentially impact-driven giving that's evidence-based, and uses disciplined planning, execution, and diligent follow-through, of course, in order to achieve intended results. It encompasses, I think, a wide range of practices, some of which you referred to, from traditional grant making, but also newer models for generating impact investing, or venture philanthropy as well. But when you think about it, the discipline is no different to strategic investing, where you make sure you do your homework, you take calculated risks based on data, wherever available, an analysis of that data, and making sure that you properly track your returns to inform your future investment behavior, except in this case, it's social or environmental returns that you're concerned about, and not financial returns. I come across many people who are so careful about how they invest their money within their own businesses, or even how they spend money. But with giving, for some reason, they have this notion that their job is to cut the check, as they say, and then leave it for God to do the rest. And I wish it was that simple, but it isn't. It's upon us, really, to follow the money, ensure that it is doing what it's intended to do, and ultimately hold ourselves accountable for the impact that it generates. Now, is this a major shift or a departure from cultural norms in the region? Perhaps in some circles, but I'm observing a huge behavioral shift anyway, including in the Middle East, with next-gen donors who are demanding more transparency and want to be far more connected to their giving. So I genuinely believe that this is a natural trend that will only increase over time. In terms of causes across the region, as you know, Karen, the region is not short of challenges. And so there is plenty for everybody to get involved in. But again, I think it's what is most exciting is the nature of philanthropy, the nature of giving, and the mechanisms through which people give, including digital platforms, is something that we've never seen before. And I think it's a very exciting trend to build on.
We have to talk about this, the moment we're living, which is the COVID-19 pandemic, and our efforts globally to get out of it, to have an economic recovery, to build better public health systems, because we know this is likely to happen again in some way. So, how do you think COVID has impacted the way philanthropy is practiced in the region or globally? I mean, you just mentioned, digital platforms. It's easier to give now on your phone, to direct to certain communities that are in trouble. But what else have we learned in this last 2 years?
So I think in many ways, the philanthropic response to COVID has really shown the sector at its best. Individual and institutional philanthropy has, in my view, been largely responsive, engaged, and nimble in response to this global crisis. The challenge, I think, and the opportunity is for the sector to make these features stick, including expanding and formalizing them with things like optimizing the grant making process, including by better use of digital tools, accelerating the pace and the volume of data-driven giving, more partnering between donors, and also better partnering with the public sector and with business to pool capital wherever that can generate a multiplier effect on impact. And I think also very importantly, investing more in local communities, directly in local communities to build resilience. Another observation, I think, is that the pandemic encouraged governments across our region in particular to really look at what regulatory changes they need to make in order to properly unlock the potential of large pools of philanthropic capital. And this is really a long overdue process, but I'm hoping, fingers crossed, that it's one that is finally happening, albeit at very varying paces across the region, but at least in the right direction.
I'm really glad you mentioned that because, you know, in my own experience in living in the Gulf and forming a civil society organization, I was part of a women's association. You know, the licensing of civil society and charities is a problem, right? It's been made very difficult for these groups to operate, and then, you know, for legitimate concerns about where money is going and who you support. So, you know, if you could advocate for certain kinds of regulatory changes, you know, how should you know, the third sector be regulated? What is the appropriate sort of mechanism for these organizations to exist and to be, you know, monitored by government, that they don't send money to the wrong hands, but also that they're also potentially partnering with government for the hard issues, whether it's climate or humanitarian disaster relief or public health concerns?
Look, you're absolutely right. And there are perhaps historic socio-political reasons why there was this mistrust or distrust of of civil society more broadly, but the philanthropic sector, and that led to a lot of giving going underground, and of course, meaning that we, as I mentioned before, simply didn't know and still don't know to a large extent where that money is going. And today, again, as I mentioned, it's not just an opportunity to generate more impact and to optimize impact, but also with the number of destructive non-state actors across the region and indeed the world, we have a duty and an obligation to make sure that we know where that money is going and to really make sure that that so-called leakage goes to zero, because we cannot afford money going into the wrong hands. And that's something, again, that means that it's not just an opportunity, but there is really an urgency. Now, in terms of what sort of regulation, as with all regulation, there really isn't one size fits all, but there are global best practices that have worked quite well. So we need to certainly be inspired by those, but also create something that suits the social and also the socio-political as well as the cultural dimensions across the region. And that might look differently. That might look different as you go across the region. But it is happening. I think that, again, the opportunity now is one that has been accelerated by the pandemic. And I'm certainly seeing, at least where I'm from and around the Gulf more broadly, those conversations being had out in the open with a view to producing conducive policy to regulate the sector and better understand capital flows within and from this sector.
I want to talk to you more a little bit about the business community, and certainly you're a big part of it in the Gulf. And you know, what do you see as the role of business in addressing certain issues, climate change being an important one, but then also you've done a lot of work through the Pearl Initiative on, you know, corporate governance and the ways that businesses should organize themselves and report on their own activities and you know, do a better job of sort of communicating within their own communities. So, you know, what do you see as I guess what could businesses do more of, right? What could they do a better job of in terms of their own giving in listening to their own employees and what employees care about. But what do you tell your own corporates in terms of where they can devote or match their charitable giving?
So business absolutely needs to assume, I think, a front seat role, if not the driving role. Of course, the government has a hugely important role to play in creating an enabling regulatory environment that we just talked about, using both carrots and sticks to create the circumstances for positive change. And in many cases, certain policy decisions and announcements, just like the UAE's landmark announcement and related strategy of going net zero by 2050, is a fantastic way to jolt business into action. And I've been harping on about this for 20 years or so, but businesses really need to see themselves as the real agents of positive change. And I think with the latest paradigm shift taking place around the fundamental role of businesses now are fully expected to be change agents for social and environmental causes. 20 years ago, when I first started engaging in this debate, it was far more difficult to engage the skeptics, and there are less of them today, but there still is a lurking notion that there must be a trade-off between profit and purpose, the notion that you have to trade one in order to generate some of the other, a zero-sum game, if you will. But I'll say it again, a business whose mission is authentically connected with the needs of society is a stronger, more resilient, and also has the potential to be a more profitable business. And in the Middle East, where social and environmental challenges are getting more complex, we can only reverse destructive trends with the full engagement of business. Is this happening? I really hope so. We certainly need to get better about reporting transparently on our broader impact. Of course, the lack of global standards on this doesn't help, but it's a rapidly developing space, and I'm involved with a few tracks that will hopefully yield some results soon. At Crescent Enterprises, we've been reporting on our sustainability performance for 10 years now. In our last reporting cycle, we shifted our focus to SDG first reporting as part of an integrated report. And a final point I think here is that where certain trends can quickly become fads, I think sustainability really is a cultural mindset now, and we're seeing a systemic cultural shift towards this way of thinking, which is fundamentally changing the way that we do business and consume products and services, and that will in turn forever change industry as we know it.
You must feel like you were 10 years ahead of the curve. I mean, before anyone was talking about ESG, you were really talking about corporate governance and about, making sustainability part of the sort of, your P&L, right? I mean, it's really, part of the core of your operation. So, I mean, where do you see your competitors? Is everyone sort of waking up? Yes, this matters, or how do you encourage other businesses to incorporate, as you say, like the SDG goals into what you do as a private corporation?
The conversations, Karen, were happening well before I got engaged, but I think where there has more recently been a fundamental shift is identifying with the business case behind sustainability and moving it from being more ornamental to fundamental, to really being an intrinsic part of one's business model. And the similar shift we noticed with the Pearl Initiative and its focus on corporate governance. We launched the Pearl Initiative just over 10 years ago in partnership with the UN Office of Partnerships to really create a culture of transparency and accountability because it makes business sense, and focusing on difficult things like anti-corruption, like diversity and inclusion, things which were nice to haves, which looked good on reports, but there wasn't necessarily always a very clear and perhaps tangible business case behind adopting those sorts of principles and measures. And so this shift, I think, is a fairly recent one, and it's a fairly recent one for the whole world, but also for the Middle East and North Africa. The conversations that we're having today with peers and with the Pearl Initiative community, you can sense that there is far more excitement around what this means for their core business, for their core businesses, as opposed to how this might just look in an annual report. So I think the momentum now is there, and I think it's unstoppable. I really do. I guess the question is to make sure that we are able to cut through some of the noise that's around it. Whenever there is excitement, there is inevitably there will be noise. So to cut through some of the noise and stay focused, and also make sure that we're adopting these practices really suited to our own businesses and our own environments, and not necessarily also just trying to apply a one-size-fits-all cookie-cutter approach, because that often doesn't work.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I appreciate that you are focused on, what's the business case for, for these kinds of reforms. I want to ask you lastly, just on, something that I know you're personally engaged with through UNESCO's International Commission on Futures of Education. When we work on job growth and looking at economic diversification across the Middle East and the Gulf in particular, as I do, the jobs crisis is very real, and no government has been particularly good at really making headway. So, in your own work and in your volunteer time and thinking about what kinds of education systemic changes could be made, what are you advocating for? What are you finding these days?
So this international commission that was created by UNESCO a couple of years ago to spearhead the Futures of Education initiative, which really set out to try and reimagine how knowledge and learning can be used to shape the futures of humanity in a more positive way, in a world of increasing complexity and, of course, uncertainty. The Commission's report is due to be launched later this month, and will address key aspects to be pursued to really better prepare Generation Z and also Alpha for the future, with a series of recommendations as a means to really reframe what it means to be human, to rebalance our relationships with others, and of course with the living planet as well, and with technology, very importantly. I personally would like to see the report inspire and inform action at the local level, and really contribute to shaping the future of education and re-education, mainly through bridging the tech divide, but also ultimately empowering these generations to identify with their purpose and to evolve as relevant change makers in their own society. In terms of where we are today, my own humble view, Karen, mostly based on my experience in business, is that many of the old models of education are simply no longer fit for purpose in the world that we live and work in today, at least here in the Middle East and more broadly. We need to be developing new models of education that are more human-centric, again, focused less exclusively on developing technical skills, but more on developing people. And that means a greater emphasis on mental health, self-confidence, cultivating empathy, critical thinking, really equipping people with the soft skills that will serve them well, no matter what happens to one particular industry or another. And I think these skills will be increasingly in very high demand.
Well, that's the true definition of resilience, isn't it? The ability to get up and dust yourself off and keep going, and think about, looking forward rather than behind. Well, I think you've given us a lot to think about in terms of our Futures Forum. You're a very forward-looking person and innovator in your work in philanthropy, and I'm just really grateful for your time. So thank you for talking with us.
Pleasure and honor is mine. Thank you, Karen.
Take care.
Hi, I'm Steven Kenney, the director of the Strategic Foresight Program here at MEI, and I'm here to wrap up this terrific third day of our Futures Forum. We heard a lot today about something that I think is really important that we want our audience to take away from the conference as a whole. And that's the idea that the future, if we look 10 years out, even 5 years out, has the prospect for looking very different, and likely will be very different than it is today. That may sound obvious, but it's something that is really important for leaders to take real time and energy to consider in ways that they don't often do. It's very natural for all of us to think that we understand that intellectually while we make decisions and take actions, as if the future were going to be plus or minus 10% different than it is today. We heard in our first panel this morning about some of the ways that the cities of the Middle East will be radically different than they are today, and also about some cities like Neom that are really different visions of what the idea of a future city even is. We heard in my conversation with Raya Bichari and Eli Mawad and Mutaz Riyadni about different futures for education and for the social contract and for the transition to renewable energy and more. And we just heard in Karen Young's conversation with Badr Jafar about a different future role and impact for philanthropy in the region. The common thread that connects all of those conversations is the theme of our day, this day in our Futures Forum, and that's people, and the idea of creating different futures for the people of the Middle East and with the people of the Middle East in all of those dimensions, and where and how they live and how they learn and many more. So it's really important to be thoughtful and deliberate in having these kinds of conversations if we want to make it possible to create those different futures. So I want to thank all of our panelists and moderators for 3 terrific, interesting, and very insightful conversations that helped paint some of those pictures. I want to encourage all of you to come back tomorrow for the 4th and final day of our Futures Forum, where we'll focus on defense and security in cyber in the Middle East region. So thank you all for being here today, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Thanks so much.